assistant in the Haddad lab at the Kellogg Biological Research Station, but Dave is stationed at John Ball Zoo in Grand Rapids. I've known Dave for a few years now, and he has done some really phenomenal work at John Ball Zoo. So we're going to learn about the Poweshiek Skipperling today. It's an endangered butterfly, and really because of Dave's efforts, we've that thing has been brought back from the brink of extinction, in my opinion. And because of Dave, we're introducing other rare butterfly breeding opportunities at the zoo, including Mitchell Satyr butterfly and Karner blue butterfly, both endangered butterflies. So Dave has done some really phenomenal work. He is a genius in butterflies. So if you need butterfly stuff, Dave's your man. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave to tell us about today's talk and start it up. So feel free to go ahead, Dave.
All right. Thanks for that, Tony. I'm going to share my screen here. And as Tony mentioned, today we're going to talk about the Great Lakes Rare Butterfly Program at the John Ball Zoo. And specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the endangered butterflies that we've been working with since 2021 to help bring back from the brink of extinction and how they tie into some of the wetlands in Michigan. So as Tony just mentioned, I'm a research assistant in the Haddad lab at Michigan State University. I first started working in Nick's lab way back in 2019 on a project that he was managing in North Carolina. And we were working with the federally endangered St. Francis satyr, which is found in kind of swampy wetlands in North Carolina. That's a subspecies of the Mitchell satyr, which is a rare wetland butterfly that we have here in Michigan. And so I started off as the crew leader for that program in 2019, and in 2021 moved my work back here to Michigan with the John Ball Zoo, helping save endangered butterflies in Michigan. The two species that we're going to be focusing on today are the Mitchell satyr, which is that photo on the left, and the Poweshiek skipperling, which is that photo on the right. Both of these are endangered butterfly species that are found in Michigan, and importantly, they're tied to prairie fen wetlands in Michigan. And so without those prairie fen wetlands, these species would not exist. So what is a prairie fen? I want to start off by saying that I am not a wetland biologist. Most of you, probably all of you on this call, know more about wetlands than I do. I'm a butterfly biologist, and so I'm going to try to get through this, what is a prairie fen and why are they important for the butterflies that we're working with. But again, I am not a wetland biologist, and so if something I say here sounds a little off, there's a good chance that it probably is. But what is a prairie fen? So prairie fens are these really, really special wetland habitat types in Michigan that are only found in the Midwest. And actually, the vast majority of prairie fens that exist in the world today are found in southern Michigan. And so that's a really unique opportunity for Michigan to help conserve and also restore and protect these prairie fen wetlands that we have. Most of these prairie fen wetlands are comprised of different graminoid species like grasses, sedges. They are importantly groundwater fed. And so a main component of prairie fens is the groundwater flow in and out of that prairie fen. You can't have a prairie fen without some sort of groundwater flow. And the groundwater chemistry that's found in these prairie fens really helps dictate the type of vegetation that will be found there. These prairie fens originated from the recession of the glaciers, which were dominant in southern Michigan at one point. There are several different types of prairie fens in Michigan. Not all prairie fens are created equal. And the prairie fen type is really dictated by the groundwater chemistry and also the groundwater flow rate. That helps determine the type of vegetation that will be found there. So there's inundated flats, sedge meadows, marl, wooded fens, and most of these are typically pretty wide open. There's not a whole lot of overstory, although you can get some of that in those wooded fens. Vegetation structure, again, depends on that groundwater chemistry. There are some unique properties to the groundwater that's found in prairie fens, especially rich in calcium and magnesium. And again, that helps determine what plants are found there. If that waterway is disrupted at all, if that groundwater changes, that will dramatically change the type of vegetation that's found in these areas. So again, many sedges, many grasses and forbs. There's a lot of really rare species that are found in prairie fens. There's a lot of rare orchids that are found there. Many rare plants and animals depend on prairie fens for their survival. Some of the important plants that we key in on for the butterflies that we work with are prairie dropseed, which is a host plant for the Poweshiek skipperling, the tussock sedge, which is really abundant in a lot of these prairie fens, and that's Carex stricta, and that is a host plant for the Mitchell satyr that we work with. Shrubby cinquefoil can be really, really abundant in some of these prairie fen wetlands, and that is a really useful nectar source for Poweshiek skipperling. And then especially important nectar source for Poweshiek skipperling is the black-eyed Susan. And so that's typically what we'll see in the prairie fens where we work in. As I mentioned before, because these areas are so special and so unique, there are a lot of really rare plants and animals and wildlife that depend on prairie fens in Michigan. It's estimated that over 50 species of rare, threatened, and endangered animals and vegetation are found in these prairie fens. So it's really important to continue to conserve and protect these prairie fens. Luckily, most of the prairie fens in Michigan are protected on some level. There are a lot that are on, private lands that landowners are doing a lot of really good habitat restoration and protection for these prairie fens just because of how important they are to the community. So if we look at the historical ice sheets that were found in Michigan, I mentioned before that these prairie fens really coincide with where those ice sheets were in Michigan. And so the interlobate regions of the Saginaw lobe and the Lake Michigan lobe, once those receded, they created these perfect conditions, these low-lying areas, these indentations in the landscape for these prairie fens to exist. And so if you look at the figure on the right there, each of those green dots is a different prairie fen in Michigan, and they coincide really well with where the edges of those lobes are for the ice sheets. And so you can see the vast majority of the prairie fens that are found in the Midwest and in Michigan are found in the kind of the lower third of the state. So Michigan's very special and very unique in that we have all of these prairie fens, and again, the vast majority of prairie fen wetlands that exist in the world are found in southern Michigan. They were at one point much more numerous and abundant throughout the Midwest, but we have about 140 prairie fens remaining in Michigan. And the reason we lost a lot of the historical prairie fens really boils down to two main threats, and that is agriculture and urbanization. So the destruction of the groundwater, the natural groundwater flow into and out of these prairie fens. Like I mentioned before, any change to the groundwater flow, the groundwater chemistry can have dramatic impacts on the vegetation that's found in these prairie fens. And then just the lack of natural disturbance. These prairie fen wetlands in the past really depended on, periodic natural disturbances from fire that would typically come in from the oak savannas, surrounding oak savannas, and penetrating into these prairie fens. And so once that natural disturbance was kind of taken off the landscape, that really altered a lot of the prairie fens that used to exist. And once the groundwater flow has been changed, it's nearly impossible to ever restore that back to how it was naturally. And so it's really, really hard once you lose a prairie fen to actually get it back. Another threat to the prairie fens also is the introduction of invasive species, especially glossy buckthorn. We've lost a lot of really good Poweshiek skipperling and Mitchell satyr prairie fen sites to invasive species, especially glossy buckthorn. So shifting gears a little bit to what the Great Lakes Rare Butterfly Program at the John Ball Zoo is and how we got started with saving these endangered butterflies that are found in wetlands in Michigan. This Great Lakes Rare Butterfly Program was started in 2021 with the major goal of helping save endangered butterflies from extinction in Michigan. We also aim to increase our understanding of threats to wetlands and pollinators. We spread awareness of the issues that are facing pollinators worldwide, and we do that in several different ways. And then we also assist our partners with conservation efforts across the state. And we work with a lot of different partners across the state and even internationally to help save these butterflies from extinction. And one of the things that the Great Lakes Rare Butterfly Program has done is actually go out periodically with our partners and help restore prairie fen wetlands, where we hope to eventually put Poweshiek skipperlings or Mitchell satyrs, or to help expand the occupiable area for these butterflies. And so that can look like, hands on the ground, taking out invasive species, taking out glossy buckthorn, cutting back shrubs, getting rid of cattails, things like that. The main topic that I'm going to focus on today is our efforts to save endangered butterflies from extinction and some of the early signs of success that we are already seeing. So again, we're going to talk about Mitchell satyr. That's the species on the left. Poweshiek skipperling is the species on the right there. And these are both two of, the many rare species that depend on prairie fen wetlands in Michigan. Before I get into what we're doing at the zoo, I want to give just a brief overview of the life history because that will kind of help you get an idea of what we're working with and what we're doing each year. And so the Poweshiek skipperling and Mitchell satyr both only fly as an adult one time per year. So they only have one adult brood each year, unlike the monarch or cabbage white or some of these other species that will fly several different times throughout the year. We really have one shot to work with the adult butterflies that we have at the John Ball Zoo. And so both of those species typically fly in late June, early July, and we'll only see them on the landscape as adults for, 3 to 4 weeks max each year. So it's a very short flight period. So we have a lot of work that we need to get done in a very short period of time. So those butterflies flying in late June, early July will lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch about a week later. And from that point, from July all the way until fall, roughly middle of October, those caterpillars are eating and slowly growing until they enter a state of diapause, which is essentially hibernation for caterpillars. So both of these species will spend the entire winter from October until early April as a caterpillar out on the landscape in the prairie fen wetlands. And they're not moving, they're not eating, they're in diapause for essentially almost 6 months until the spring arrives and their host plants start regrowing. Once that happens, then they break that diapause. They begin feeding again, and this is when they start to grow really, really quickly. From about, the beginning of April until the middle of June, they become a pupa, and 2 weeks later, we have butterflies again. So this period from late June until middle of July is the really, really busy part of our butterfly program at the John Ball Zoo. That's where we need to get all of the work done with the adults that we can. So doing a little more deep dive into the Poweshiek skipperling, this was at one point one of the most abundant butterflies on the landscape in the Midwest. Their core of their range was found in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa. You can see their populations just barely extended east into Michigan. What's interesting about this range is that when they were present in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa, they were using these tall grass prairies, not really a wetland of any sort. But in Michigan, they're seen only using prairie fens, where there is that groundwater component, there's that wetland. And so they can use both of those types of habitat. It is ranked as federally endangered, and at one point was probably one of the most endangered, probably one of the rarest animals in the entire world. Not just rarest butterflies in Michigan or in the Midwest, but one of the rarest animals in the entire world, and almost became extinct. So I'll get into that a little more in a second. But you can see each of these black dots is a Poweshiek Skipperling population that we knew existed at one point. And this is what we are currently left with for the remaining populations of Poweshiek Skipperling. So it's kind of interesting that they are still just barely hanging on at the extreme ends of their range. So in the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve in Manitoba, just over the border from Minnesota, and then in those prairie fens on the east side of the state in Oakland County in Michigan, everything else in between has been lost. All of those populations are gone. And it didn't happen over, a super long period of time. The collapse of Poweshiek Skipperling and their populations happened extremely quickly. And so that is something that was, very, very concerning. So within Michigan, again, we kind of see where the distribution of these prairie fens are. Pavlik skipperlings were never super abundant throughout lower Michigan, but they were found in high numbers in the sites where they did exist. And so what we're left with now really is just a few of the spots in Oakland County where this butterfly is still barely hanging on. This picture on the right there shows you what, in my mind, a perfect Poweshiek skipperling prairie fen wetland looks like. You'll notice it's really wide open. There's a lot of graminoids. Not much overstory within the prairie fen itself. Usually we'll see both black-eyed Susans and shrubby cinquefoil in really high abundance in those sites. And usually we'll see at least some prairie drop seed in some of these sites as well. And so that gives you an idea of what a really, really good prairie fen wetland looks like where we would expect Poweshiek skipperlings to do really well. So we work with Michigan Natural Features Inventory. We work very, very closely with them. And they're the organization in Michigan that goes out every year and surveys for Poweshiek skipperlings. And they've been doing this since at least 2014. I think non-standardized surveys from even prior to that. But you can see just how quickly within Michigan these populations disappeared. Each of those lines is a different population in Michigan. And you can see even some populations that blue line there that were doing really, really well collapsed just within a several year period. And in 2022, the Poweshiek skipperling nearly disappeared from Michigan altogether. I think on standardized surveys within the prairie fens in Michigan, Michigan Natural Features Inventory only saw 9 Poweshiek skipperlings combined, all of their surveys together. And so at that level, all of us who are working on this project were kind of freaking out. Like they just can't bounce back on their own from those numbers. So we really came very, very close to losing the species altogether. Mitchell Satyr, on the other hand, is doing a little bit better than Poweshiek skipperling, but still we're seeing some very concerning trends with their populations in Michigan. This one is much more of a habitat specialist. Like they can't be found outside of prairie fens. Like Poweshiek skipperling was found in those tallgrass prairies out in the Midwest. Mitchell Satyr really is tied to prairie fens. They like the much wetter areas. Carex stricta, their host plant, grows in much wetter areas, and so they're really, really tied to prairie fens. The figure on the right there shows the extent of Mitchell Satyr populations and where they used to exist. And so one of the things that we've been doing is really working with a genetics lab at Michigan State University to figure out how all of these different populations are related. So, like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I started working with the St. Francis satyr, which is a subspecies of Mitchell satyr that's found in North Carolina. You can see that dot on the figure there. Before I started working with the butterflies in Michigan. And at that time, it was kind of thought that the Michigan, Mississippi, Alabama, and Virginia populations were all the same, and that North Carolina was kind of the satellite subspecies population. We're doing some genetic work now that actually shows that Michigan is very, very distinct. It probably was Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Ohio, all kind of being the same subspecies at one point. But Wisconsin, Indiana, and Ohio have lost all of their populations of Mitchell satyr, and they have for quite a while. And so it's really, really important for us now, with our better understanding of how these populations are related and the genetics, Michigan being its own unique thing, it's very, very important for us to help protect those remaining populations that are found in the wetlands in Michigan. So this figure here, or this picture here, gives you a better idea of what the Mitchell Satyr habitat looks like. That's Bill Flanagan on the left-hand side of the photo there. He's the conservation manager at the John Ball Zoo, and so he's, the one that I contacted when we were first starting the Great Lakes Rare Butterfly Program, and we formed this partnership with Michigan State University and John Ball Zoo. And he's out in the field in this photo with individuals from a bunch of our different partners, and this was the very first collection of Mitchell satyrs to get those butterflies into the Great Lakes Rare Butterfly Program. But you'll see compared to Poweshiek, it's a little more closed. It's a little wetter. There's a lot more sedges, so a lot of Carex stricta. And usually they're even found in a little more closed, more canopy areas with more tamaracks. So they like it a little shadier. They're found in those wetter, shadier locations in prairie fens, opposed to Poweshiek, which are in those wide open, really hot prairie fen areas. So we know these species are declining and they declined really, really quickly. I should mention it's not just Poweshiek and Mitchell satyrs that are declining. Butterflies across the entire world are declining at really rapid rates. So why do we think that's happening? How did these species go from, some of the most abundant butterflies on the landscape in the Midwest to now some of the rarest species? Unfortunately, there's quite a few threats that I'm going to talk about. And the first main one is habitat destruction. So we've mentioned any changes to the alteration of the waterways that get into these prairie fens, destruction of prairies and destruction of prairie fens really can have a dramatic impact on those specialists that depend on these specific types of habitat for survival. We've lost over 99.5. I think some estimates are even 99.9% of the prairies and prairie fens that once existed on the landscape. We've lost the vast majority of them. And so when you take away that habitat for these specialists, you take away those species that are found in there. So that was the first big hit to a lot of these, specialists that depend on these wetlands. The next big one is the increased use of pesticides, especially neonicotinoid pesticides. And so the big collapse of Poweshiek skipperling in like Wisconsin or in Minnesota, North and South Dakota, kind of the prairie area out there, can be really tied to the increased use of pesticides, especially for soybean aphids. And so when they were spraying for soybean aphids, they would use these airplanes. It would be an aerial spray that they would spray over the fields. Well, that aerial spray of pesticides can travel for miles and miles and miles outside of the intended treatment areas. And if that gets into the prairie fens, especially these neonicotinoids, they persist in the environment for years and years and years and can have extremely detrimental impacts to butterflies and other species. We're seeing some issues with climatic changes, and we're starting to study how some of these changes might affect these butterflies on the landscape. I mentioned that these species that we work with overwinter as caterpillars, and there's some thought that they might depend on snowpack over the winter to help buffer the temperatures and the humidity. Underneath the snowpack, the temperature is very consistent. It's about 32 degrees and really high humidity. But if you take that away and you get some of these really, really cold snaps and there's no protection for those caterpillars, that could have a really negative impact on those populations surviving over winter. And also, we're seeing these extended growing periods where it's staying warmer and warmer into, late September and October, where we're getting 80-degree days. And if these caterpillars grow too quickly in the summer, they won't be able to survive diapause as well. But there's also a thought that they could potentially have a second flight period, which they don't naturally have. And then there wouldn't be enough time for them to mate, lay eggs, and those caterpillars to grow up. And so it could be a lost generation if that happens. So there's a lot of different ways that climate can impact the butterflies out on the landscape. We've already mentioned this one, hydrological changes, any alteration to the waterway getting into prairie fens and these other wetlands will have a dramatic effect on the plant composition that's found in these prairie fens. These butterflies are very tied to their host plants. You can't find them in areas where they don't have their host plants. And so if that vegetation changes in those prairie fens, it could wipe out the available habitat for those butterflies. And then ultimately, what we've seen with a lot of populations of Poweshiek skipperling and Mitchell satyr in Michigan is that these populations will continue to decline year after year, and then they might just hang on at these really low baseline levels. But really, they're, 5 or 10 butterflies seen on surveys. They just don't have the opportunity to bounce back, and they also end up with high levels of inbreeding and other genetic issues where eventually they kind of just hang on and hang on and hang on until they ultimately disappear. We've never seen it where those populations are very, very low and then all of a sudden bounce back on their own. And so that's kind of where this rare butterfly program at the John Ball Zoo comes in, where we're trying to help these populations bounce back. We've identified that they're not going to be able to do it on their own in a lot of these sites where they exist. And so, in order, kind of a last-ditch effort to help save these species from extinction, we joined in 2021 what is called the Poweshiek Skipperling International Partnership. And that's a huge coalition of land managers, habitat managers, different zoos. So we work closely with Minnesota Zoo, Assiniboine Park Zoo in Manitoba, Canada. They are managing that population of Poweshiek skipperlings that remains in Manitoba. Federal agencies, DNR, all sorts of partners to save that one species from extinction. And so that's actually what we did starting in 2021. We joined that group, and the hoop house on the left there is what we were operating out of. That was our kind of home base for what I'm about to talk about in a few slides. Because of how successful that program has been, we've really grown considerably over just the last few years. And so this is what our current facility looks like in 2026. There's a lot more infrastructure, bigger hoop houses, more space. And that's allowed us to grow that program from, I'll show you an example on some of the slides here in a second. But yeah, our facilities continue to grow and we continue to, push the envelope on what we do every year. So working with Poweshiek Skipperling, that started in 2021, and Minnesota Zoo had been coming to Michigan every year and doing a head starting program for Poweshiek Skipperling. They would go out in those prairie fen wetlands, they would collect female Poweshiek Skipperlings, they would lay eggs in captivity. Those eggs would then be taken back to Minnesota. They would raise them for a year and then come back to Michigan the next year to release them. Unfortunately, those efforts, while they were getting some butterflies back out into the wild, the populations continued to decline. So those head started individuals, a lot of times it was only 30 or 40 butterflies. That wasn't enough to have a positive impact on the populations. They continued to decline. And so the Poweshiek Skipperling International Partnership made a decision to pivot. Instead of head starting and releasing the offspring in 2021, the decision was made that all of those butterflies that Minnesota Zoo had in their ex situ facility would be brought to John Ball Zoo, and we would attempt something that had never been done before. Consistent breeding of Poweshiek skipperling in captivity. It wasn't even known if this was something that could be possible or could be done consistently and repeatedly year after year. But it was also recognized that if we couldn't figure out how to do this and we couldn't figure out how to release many, many more butterflies into the wild, the Poweshiek skipperlings were going to be lost anyway. And so this was kind of like the last ditch Hail Mary, like let's see if we can really ramp up captive breeding, more butterflies going out in the wild as a last ditch effort to save the species. A couple of the other goals with that, though, is if we could figure out how to breed them in captivity, we then wanted to maintain an insurance population at the zoo. An insurance population is something that you never really want to depend on. It's not something that you ever want to have to like put into effect. Insurance population means that we are holding butterflies at the John Ball Zoo indefinitely every single year. They're not going out into the wild, they're being retained for captive breeding because at one point at least there was very serious concern that we would go out the next year and not see any wild Poweshiek skipperlings in Michigan. The decline was happening so quickly that that was a very serious concern. If that were to happen, and we just released everything that we had every year, we would not have any more butterflies to work with. They would essentially be done. Maintaining that insurance population at the zoo allows us, even if they disappear in the wild, allows us to continue to breed them, continue to work with them until we can release more and more butterflies out in the wild. So, a very scary situation to be in where, the species survival is dependent on an insurance population, but unfortunately, that's the position that we were in. But of course, we don't want to hold all of the butterflies at the zoo. That would defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do. And so we wanted to get to a point where we could release hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of Poweshiek skipperlings every year back in the wild to help those populations that were still barely hanging on, but also to start new populations and start to get more Poweshiek skipperlings on the landscape, not only in Michigan, but across their historical range. So long story short, we did end up figuring out how to breed Poweshiek skipperlings in captivity that first year. Of those 32 butterflies that Minnesota Zoo brought us, roughly half are male and half are female, and we did get 8 breeding pairs that year. Almost 600 eggs were collected from those breeding pairs, and at the time, this was by far many, many times more eggs than had ever been collected from head starting, from bringing females in from the wild. And part of the reason is because they lay the majority of their eggs immediately, like within a first day after breeding. And so you just miss a lot of those eggs from those butterflies you collect in the wild. But also we retain those females for their life, and we've averaged about 100 to 150 eggs per female that we breed at the zoo. So we can expand our facility space and we can expand the number of caterpillars and ultimately butterflies that we're working with really quickly if we can ramp up captive breeding. The one big issue we had that very first year while we were still figuring out our protocols was caterpillar survival. After the eggs hatched, our caterpillars didn't survive super well until that winter period. And so we identified going into 2022 as that being the life stage that we really wanted to focus on, try to figure out how to increase our survival of those caterpillars. But overall, successful proof of concept shows that captive breeding can happen in these ex situ facilities. And so that gave us some hope going into 2022. 2022 is when we really took a big step forward with the captive breeding efforts at the John Ball Zoo. We bred 17 pairs this year and we collected almost 1,700 eggs. And one thing I want to note is that in each of these slides, you'll see like certain number of eggs going to Minnesota Zoo. Again, a very close partner of ours. And the reason we do that, instead of just keeping all of the eggs at the John Ball Zoo, is that we really don't want all of our eggs in one basket. We want to have redundancy in 2 different locations in case something really catastrophic happens to one of these programs. You could imagine like a disease coming through, wiping out, the captive population. That is a concern. We haven't seen it yet, but it could happen. Other things like how many tornadoes have we already had in Michigan this spring, right? If a tornado were to come through and hit our hoop houses with these caterpillars out here, that could be really bad. A big oak tree falling on our hoop house or something. And so having that redundancy built in where the entire cohort is not in one location is a really important part of this program. And then notably, we did have much higher survival rate of those caterpillars in 2022 to diapause. So really quickly ramping up the program. You'll also remember from the figure I showed you of those population levels and how they were declining. 2022 being the very worst year for Poweshiek skipperling ever in Michigan. Again, those 9 wild butterflies found. We didn't have to retain all of the butterflies in 2022 from the 2021 cohort. We were able to release a little over 100 butterflies back into those fen wetlands in Michigan, where the butterflies were still barely hanging on. 102 butterflies split over a couple different sites is not really a lot. It's not a ton. We recognized that that wasn't going to be, the thing that saves this species. But what we were hoping, based on those really, really low population levels, was that this would allow them just to hang on for one more year. We knew we had a lot of caterpillars and ultimately a lot of butterflies that would go out in 2020. could just hang on for one more year, we would have a really good chance of helping those populations in the future. Every year, we continue to expand what we've been doing for captive breeding. We now had 30 breeding pairs in 2023. Minnesota Zoo did a little bit of breeding in their facilities as well. And so we almost had 4,000 Poweshiek Skipperling eggs at this point laid in our facilities combined. And so that's a huge number. You can see just from 2021, those 32 butterflies we started with, to now 2023 with almost 4,000 eggs, it can ramp up really considerably. And that's a good thing because we didn't have a whole lot of time to waste. This was also a record-breaking year for releases for butterflies into the wild in Michigan. We released over 500 butterflies. And one really exciting thing is that we saw those butterflies that we were releasing, we saw them interacting with each other and we saw them acting wild. We saw them breeding in the wild. So that's what this picture is on the right here. All of the butterflies that we release from our zoo programs are marked with Sharpie markers so that when Michigan Natural Features Inventory is out in the field doing their surveys, if they see a butterfly with no marks on it at all, they know that that's a wild Poweshiek skipperling. If they see butterflies with marks on them, they know that that's a butterfly that came from the zoo. And so that's how we can track what the wild population is doing year after year with these large scale releases that we're now doing. But it also gives us the opportunity to observe their behavior in the wild. When you raise a species like this in captivity for almost its entire life cycle, you never know how they're going to respond to now being released into these big, wide open prairie fen wetlands, right? And so this was really the first big test. Like, let's see what they're doing. Let's observe their behavior. And seeing our butterflies out in the wild mating and seeing the females out there laying eggs gave us a lot of hope. Like that was a big hurdle for us to cross. Like, okay, they're actually finding each other, they're doing what they're supposed to do. Now let's see if it's going to have an impact on those wild population levels. Continued more breeding in 2024, 50 breeding pairs. Again, many, many eggs laid in captivity, a lot hatching at the John Ball Zoo. But this again was a record-breaking year for number of butterflies released in Michigan. Almost 1,500 Poweshiek skipperlings, probably more than had been on the landscape in many, many, many years combined going out. And I love this photo on the right here, male and female breeding that Dave Cothrell from MNFI photographed. Those different dot colors, so the one is like a dark blue and the other is a double red. That means that they were released on different days. So they weren't released all at the same time on the same day and found each other. These were butterflies that were released on different days and were surviving in the wild and ultimately found each other. Just more indication that what we're doing has the potential to work. Because we had so many butterflies for release in 2024, we attempted the very first reintroduction of Poweshiek skipperling in Michigan. And the butterflies went to a prairie fen wetland very close to where the other populations are, but it was an area where we know why the Poweshieks disappeared, and it's because glossy buckthorn came in and invaded that prairie fen patch to the point where it pushed all of the Poweshiek skipperlings and their available habitat out. The land manager that we work with for years went in and restored that habitat, manually removing the invasive species. The native seed bank came back with the host plants and the nectar sources that Poweshiek skipperling needs. The land manager also planted thousands of native prairie plugs, including plants that Poweshiek skipperlings key in on. And after several years of that, the habitat looked perfect. And so we thought this will be the perfect opportunity to try the first reintroduction. And we recognized that this would have a really big impact on what we do in the future. If the reintroduction doesn't work, then we're going to really have to figure out why it doesn't work, why those butterflies aren't taking before we apply what we know to the entire landscape where Poweshiek skipperlings used to be found. So there was a lot riding on this reintroduction. If reintroduction efforts aren't going to work, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble with the recovery for this species across their range. So because they only fly one time, we released about 500 butterflies to that site in 2024. We had to wait until 2025, this past summer, to see if we would see butterflies at that site. If we go back there and we see butterflies flying, we know that our reintroduction effort worked. So in 2025, this past summer, we had our most breeding pairs ever. We had over 5,000 eggs laid at the John Ball Zoo. Another, great year for releases in Michigan. 1,300 butterflies released, and most importantly, we saw a large number of butterflies flying at the reintroduction site. So that means we knew that they were able to survive in there. They had their host plants, they had the nectar sources that they needed. And so we continue to augment that site for at least 3 years. But initial indications are that the Poweshiek Skipperlings are doing super well at that reintroduction site. And so that gives us some momentum moving forward. And so this year, if everything goes well, we're going to be attempting the first reintroduction effort outside of Oakland County. So quite a ways removed from Oakland County, from the extant sites that are on the landscape right now. They're going to go to a prairie fen wetland that is very well managed. We work with a lot of partners there, and everybody's very excited for this. They used to fly in that location, and so this will be a really, really big test to see if we can get them outside of Oakland County, start to get them into new locations, larger locations, so that this will help inform what we do moving forward. We'd love to see these butterflies back in Minnesota and North and South Dakota, Wisconsin, some of these areas that used to have Poweshieks. That's really what the recovery goals and the recovery effort for Poweshiek Skipperling need. And so very exciting year coming up here for 2026. So I just gave you a quick rundown of all the releases that we have been doing since 2022. That's the first year that our program helped release zoo-reared butterflies back in the wild. So I showed you this before. 2022, by far the worst year for Poweshiek Skipperling in Michigan. We were very concerned that we would lose them all. But after captive breeding success and after some of those large scale releases, it's very abundantly obvious that what we are doing is working, is having an impact on those wild populations. In most cases, the populations in the wild now are healthier from a number standpoint, from a population level standpoint, than they have been for, well over 10 years, probably longer than that. The light blue reintroduction that started in 2024. We saw a bunch of more butterflies in 2025, so we saw that they recruited and populations are increasing. We released more butterflies there last year, so we expect that line to keep moving up. But this just goes to show how, in just a few short years, how big of an impact we've been able to have on these wetland butterflies. I really think like if this program had started 1 year later, if we didn't have anything to release in 2022, I really think that there's a good chance we would have lost this species altogether in Michigan. So the butterfly came, I mean, extremely close to being eliminated altogether. So this is very encouraging for us. This is what keeps us going. This is why we continue to do what we do. So tying that back a little more into like the wetlands that they depend on, I wanted to make a point to, say that we are working with these landscape managers and these habitat managers extensively. And it's really because of their efforts that we're able to do what we're doing. It doesn't really matter if we raise 2 or 3 or 4 or 5,000 Poweshiek skipperlings in captivity at the zoo if there's no habitat for them to be released back into. And so that habitat, like that reintroduction site where the invasive species were removed, like that's super important and super critical for our program. And so without the active management of prairie fen wetlands in Michigan, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And so we're frequently in contact with these land managers. We're helping them figure out where to burn, how frequently to burn, how much to burn, what invasive species to remove, how many shrubs to remove. And that is really a big component for the success that we've seen. And it's not just maintaining the habitat where they are, it's improving the habitat on the edges of that habitat to make it bigger. But it's also to restore areas that have been lost and to restore areas not just in Michigan, but across the Midwest. And so working with these landscape managers in Michigan and around the Midwest is just an absolutely critical component for this. And it's not something that we would be able to do on our own. We are completely busy at the zoo rearing these butterflies, and we're working with these partners that are out there improving habitat. Maybe a lot of you on the call have been able to, help improve wetlands in Michigan, and that directly impacts what we're able to do and how successful we are. So much gratitude to all of the wetland warriors out there that are helping us get this habitat ready for the butterflies that we're raising. So I'll switch gears a little bit here to Mitchell Satyr. This is a little bit newer of a program. We started this in 2023. It's not as big of it's no international partnership. We work very closely with a lot of different individuals and organizations in Michigan. And so this is much more kind of localized scale than Poweshiek Skipperling, but we started in 2023 and we really just went out and collected females from one of the most abundant populations in Michigan, brought them into the zoo, and we wanted to just test some of our protocols to see if similar things we do for Poweshiek Skipperling would work for Mitchell Satyr. There have been a couple other groups that were working with Mitchell Satyrs before us. But there was a lot of issues just keeping the caterpillars alive, especially keeping them alive like right after they hatch and then going into winter. And so this is something that we really had to figure out on our own, with some insight from those other groups. Like, how do we get the survival rate? Can we actually get the survival rate high enough that we can release butterflies into Michigan? Long story short, again, we did keep some of those butterflies alive over the winter, or caterpillars alive over the winter. And the year after our initial collections, we were able to release 44 butterflies into a reintroduction site in Michigan that was already a little bit established. And again, we're marking those butterflies that go out to that reintroduction site so we can see what impact that has on those wild populations. 44 butterflies, not a lot, but a good proof of concept, like after that first year, that this is, again, something that is possible to do. And so going into 2024, 2025, that was really the exponential growth phase for this program. So started off small, proof of concept. We can see that it is working. Let's expand that like we did for Poweshiek. So 2024, we continued with our collections, but we also tried to breed the species in captivity for the first time. Again, this is something that hadn't really been done before, and so we had to figure out the best methods for breeding Mitchell satyrs in captivity. But that's really how we can ramp up the number of caterpillars that we're working with and butterflies that we're able to release. It's better for us just to hold the butterflies at the zoo, hold 9 pairs of butterflies at the zoo and collect 900 eggs from those instead of collecting like 30 or 40 butterflies from the wild. Now we don't have to pull those butterflies out of the wild. If we can ramp up the breeding at the zoo, then that's, more beneficial to the populations. So this past year, 2025, massive increase in the number of Mitchell satyrs that we were able to increase, or that we were able to release. We released 281 butterflies into that same reintroduction site just to really get that site healthy genetically, introducing new genetics into that site, but also just get the numbers high enough where they will hopefully be stable on their own. Um, and so that was very exciting. And then going into 2016, so this year is going to be a really exciting year for our program. The Mitchell Satyr Working Group has identified a new site to reintroduce Mitchell Satyrs. The previous reintroduction site that I just talked about is doing really well. And so this is something that we're going to be attempting for the first time in Michigan at a site that has never had Mitchell Satyrs, but has a very healthy wetland, prairie fen wetland that they have been managing extensively. And so this photo on the right here is taken like a week and a half ago after one of their burns. And we're out there with some of our partners and we identified the reintroduction location where the butterflies will go. So very exciting piece for this program. Like, let's see if we can get another population of Mitchell satyrs out on the landscape. These land managers have committed to annual wetland management and improvement. And so what that looks like is, frequent disturbance on the landscape. In the lack of those disturbances, the shrubs will grow up way too quickly, especially in the Mitchell Saders area, and push them out. Also, like managing water levels is something that you might not think could be as important as it really is. So beavers can dam up locations, pushing water back and flooding out occupied habitat for the butterflies. And so if that happens, you could lose an entire population that way. So they're committed to just monitoring what's happening in these wetlands so that we have the best chance of success. So it's great to work with all of these, landscape partners that we're working with. It's really a huge driver in our program. I've touched on it a few times, but I just wanted to mention some of our partners. Like, this is not an all-inclusive list of who we work with. It would take many slides to do that, but we work with so many different individuals and organizations that make this happen. Like I mentioned, it doesn't matter how successful we are at the zoo if there's no habitat out on the land for them to be released to. And so the land managers, Michigan Nature Association, Nature Conservancy, Kalamazoo Nature Center, getting just permission to do what we're doing. Like, these are endangered species, and there's a lot of time and effort that goes into making these decisions with Michigan DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that we're doing things in the most appropriate, scientifically sound way possible. And I really think that that's why we've been so successful up to this point. And I also want to mention that a lot of the funding, in fact, the majority of the funding for this program comes from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. John Ball Zoo also has a conservation fund that they manage every year, and a lot of the conservation fund helps fill in the gaps for the program that we manage. And so it takes a huge coalition of all of these groups to really make sure that we're successful. And it really wouldn't be successful without everybody working together to save these endangered wetland butterflies. There's a lot more that I could talk about. I think I've probably already gone over my allotted time here a little bit, but I could talk about, like, we're doing genetic research, we're doing pesticide monitoring. There's just so much that goes into this program and making sure that this is successful. And so uh, I feel very lucky that I get to be a part of this effort to help save these endangered butterflies. Uh, yeah, it's like my favorite thing to do, and I look forward to doing it for a lot longer. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thanks so much, Dave. Again, I think you're doing some really phenomenal work out there, and it's a pleasure to see the results continue to blossom. Um, I have two questions for you. First is, can zoo visitors tour the butterfly rearing facility?
That is a fantastic question. Typically, no. So our rearing facilities are off exhibit. Not only that, there's a ton of construction going around, like on throughout the area right now, and so it's even a little challenging to get to. If there was interest from like a group, we do behind the scenes tours. Like, if like the wetland group wanted to come and see it, we could set that up, and that could be set up through myself and Bill Flanagan at the John Ball Zoo. We do a lot of educational tours behind the scenes. We do a lot of like school groups will come throughout the summer, and we'll show them what we're doing. We've had native plant groups come through, different conservation groups come through. And so it's not something that individual just going to the zoo that day could just pop on back. But if we set it up in advance, we can definitely do some, behind the scenes tours and stuff like that.
Nicole, maybe we can talk about ideas for that. And then a second question. I don't know if you want to answer this specifically or not, but what county are you planning to release in aside from Oakland County?
Yeah, I think as long as I don't, so we're prohibited from stating the, locations for where these butterflies are found because we've had a lot of issues actually with Poweshiek Skipperling and people trespassing, like photographers and wildlife enthusiasts. In fact, trespassing in areas where we've seen females laying eggs and stomping the vegetation. So we're not really allowed to give the specific locations, but we are looking at a location in Jackson County. um, there's a really nice complex of wetlands there, and we think they'll do pretty well.
Excellent. And then I had a question for you. So you talk about, this new release and reintroductions. How do you evaluate that a reintroduction has been successful?
So if it's a reintroduction, the first thing I guess that I would look for is there any recruitment? So the butterfly only flies one time per year. You release and you go back the next year and see if you see butterflies there. That would be my first indication either this is gonna work or this could work or it's not gonna work. If you release 500 butterflies one year and you go back the next year and you don't see anything, that would be very concerning to me. That means, there's probably something there that they don't have that they're missing and that we're missing. If you see some recruitment the year after a release and you see butterflies there, that in my mind is the first indication that this could work. Um, I guess that's yeah. I think everybody has probably different levels of like what is successful or not. But when we're planning these reintroductions out, we're not planning on just like putting some butterflies there one year and then stepping away. We are planning on augmenting these sites for at least 3 years and then assessing what we see on the landscape. So ideally, you'll see those populations increase every year. Because we haven't done this a lot, we've only done that one reintroduction. We don't know really what success looks like. I mean, eventually we have to step away from release. We can't release at all the sites all the time every year. We want to be able to step back from those releases and let those butterflies exist on their own without augmentation of new individuals. And so ultimate success in my mind is being able to get the population to a level where it's high enough that it can self-sustain on its own. We can step back and they're doing well in that landscape on their own. So that would be what I would consider, ultimate success. And I think this is the first year that we're going to step away from releasing at one of the sites in Oakland County that seems like it's probably saturated population wise. And we're going to step back from releases for the first time since 2020. I mean, they've even been augmenting that site before we were breeding. And so if they can continue to persist at similar levels to where they are now without our involvement, that's ultimate success in my mind.
Great. And then just one more question. I know we're very close to time, but it's a really great one. So the Michigan Wetland Association recently had a webinar about private land wetland restoration. Are there or potential funding future opportunities to work with private landowners where habitat exists? And is there a minimum wetland size that is needed for viable populations?
Yeah, minimum wetland size is a tough one because it's not just the wetland, it's like the occupiable habitat within the wetland. Not all of the area within a wetland will be occupiable by Poweshiek or Mitchells. So I don't have a great answer for that, but I do think that private landowners would be great to work with. For reintroduction purposes or introduction purposes, there are a lot of requirements that we want to see met before we decide to put an endangered species out there. Commitment to managing that habitat for that species for the considerable future. We don't want to put a bunch of butterflies there and then have a private landowner not manage the habitat. It grows up and then it's gone. Then that effort is wasted. And so there's a lot. If the private landowners are interested in conservation, there are ways to work with them, and it has been done in the past. But that's something that would be coordinated through Fish and Wildlife Service and DNR to get a lot of those regulations in place and a lot of those, once you have an endangered butterfly on your property, it kind of changes how you manage that and what you're able to do. And so I think private landowners would be great to work with as long as they're interested in, continuing on that legacy after those butterflies are there.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We're going to call it there. And, again, Dave, you're doing some really wonderful work for endangered species. So just keep it up. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.